Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Enhancing Data Security in Higher Education Institutions. And I think this is a fascinating topic because the dichotomy of data that educational institutions touch, I think it's very complex when you consider that data goes from being sometimes private to public to private again. And obviously, educational institutions have to foster and cultivate an environment where learning is at the front for everybody. So we have two amazing speakers today, Gerard Culley, who's Director of Information Technology at UCC. Myself and Gerard go back many years at this stage, I would say. And Gerard has incredible, extensive experience working in both the private and public sectors, companies like Musgraves and Heineken, and obviously now with the very prestigious UCC. So fascinated to get Gerard's perspective on this. And then also Justin Doyle, who's Deputy Director of IT at Dublin University, and covering cloud services, cybersecurity, network, storage integration, data centers, and disaster recovery. So definitely a lot on your plate there, Justin, and hopefully this makes for a very interesting conversation. So, guys, in my introduction, I touched on the data that you see in an educational facility, institution rather. I think it's a complex type of data versus, say, a bank or a very large, heavily private entity, and the ability to protect that data and how it traverses the organization while still cultivating an environment that's conducive to learning is a challenge for people in your position. So I'd like to try and tease out some of the strategies that you guys are looking at to address these challenges for the higher educational facility as we move along. But I will set out one benchmark that I think will form an interesting pillar for the conversation, and that is that it's now widely regarded that the educational vertical is probably the second most targeted vertical globally after healthcare, which is it's a scary statistic when you consider that what you guys do is, you're trying to educate people, right? So you'd wonder, why is it so heavily targeted? And when you consider that it's second to healthcare, it definitely means that you guys have a lot on your plate in terms of defending your institutions against these types of attacks and so forth. So I guess, Gerard, we'll start off with you. And from your perspective, right, you've seen a lot. You're really in the trenches of making sure that UCC stays secure. What challenges do educational institutions face in managing secure, sensitive data, while maintaining that environment where people can learn?
Thanks, Ronan, and thank you for the introduction, a very kind introduction, and I think thank you as well for the segue into it, because I think you've actually given quite a large explanation yourself as you introduced it. I mean, I believe universities are such targets because they really mirror society. I mean, if you're looking at what organization has got banking, retail, it has research, it has teaching, it has a bit of engineering, it has a finance department, it's got HR. So universities really look like a government, from the perspective of systems and different functional areas and different types of data. So they're very attractive targets. Let's say if somebody is practicing for, let's say, a state attack, a university is a good training ground for that. The other thing, and you quite rightly pointed out, we've got a dual mandate. We have an obligation, which is our predominant obligation, to safeguard the data entrusted to us by our research community, our partners, but actually our students in the main and our staff, and making sure that data stays safe. And then on the counter to that, we want to create a free learning environment as well, so people can explore and discover, and they can maybe have a machine that's doing something a bit unusual because they're testing a piece of research. We would have tried to, and we've gone through loads of stages of expansion. We've tried to move away from storage on disks. We've got rid of removable disk backups. We've actually moved away from network storage and probably moved towards cloud storage. So the scale and complexity and the diversity of the data is immense. And we really try to look at zoning our data where possible. So, if you are into contact with any kind of personal or sensitive data belonging to anybody else, you're in a different zone. You're in, I suppose, the red zone where, controls are as tight as they are in a bank and corporates, and that's what we got to enforce. We try to create, I suppose, other zones of exploration as well then, which would be maybe closer analogy to green zones, whereby maybe it's Wi-Fi only, and maybe our controls are a bit more lax. We might allow bring your own device in that environment because we've created security perimeters that allow nothing get out of that environment. But that does allow students bring their own device, experiment, collaborate, and academic colleagues can do that as well. So to summarize it, yes, it's a big challenge. We are a target because I think we're very similar to a nation state, but obviously far smaller, but in terms of diversity of data. And how we try to counteract that is we take a very serious view on those red zones, and anywhere that's within touching distance of our corporate or personal data is as rigorously controlled as you would see in a bank. And we try to implement slightly more open access to the internet in other zones where we kind of ring fence those zones. And again, that's largely wireless traffic and Wi-Fi traffic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Just on that point, Ger, right? I'm going to ask you a contentious question we hadn't planned for, right? But I was on a trip a few years ago with the president of a very well-regarded university, and he said to me that universities are political animals, right? You've all of these different stakeholders across different departments, and I remember in this particular scenario, this university had a whole area that specialized in health, right? And they had a whole pile of different consultants who were responsible for clinical diagnosis and so forth, right? And they point blank refused to engage in the type of security hardening that the university wanted to follow. And they found it was really problematic. I mean, do you guys find those type? No, I'm not asking you to point anyone out, but do you find that that's a real challenge in the educational sector?
I think the attack on the HSE was a game changer in terms of culture. I mean, the art of the impossible, the appalling happened then. The entire, within notice, the bulk of the state's medical data was compromised, and the implications, the health implications, potentially loss of treatment was so immense. I think it actually permanently put that to bed. Can you still hear me, Ronan?
Yeah, no, we're listening. Yeah, that's a great answer.
So I think that permanently addressed that challenge. I mean, universities are by their nature pluralist, so they tend to like to have autonomous entity. But I think cyber is now such a public issue that I think they play ball now broadly, and everybody is keen on because I think everybody understands the damage and the implications from a breach. So I think unfortunately for the HSE, they fought that battle for the rest of us.
Yeah. So Justin, I'm going to jump over to you, right? I think Ger has set it out very, very well there from a foundational perspective, but I want to challenge Ger's view on the world, right? Because I mean, obviously, we all learn from what happened with the HSE, but when we look at Police Service of Northern Ireland, they clearly didn't learn, right? They didn't have the adequate controls, and they didn't have the proper understanding of how they should, protect their systems. Now, you could argue that a lot of companies or a lot of public organizations or private organizations have, but then clearly lots haven't. That's why, we continue to see the types of attack that are taking place globally. From your perspective, what types of attacks are you guys seeing, or what is it that keeps you awake at night in terms of cyber?
Yeah, so we're seeing a myriad of attacks, and actually in conjunction with SmartTech, when we go through our calls, our weekly calls, you guys are able to highlight to us exactly issues that we're seeing through our QRadar, our SIEM solution, etc. But I suppose some of the ones that come up even outside of that. So invoice fraud is one that we actually see on a semi-regular basis. So we see people trying to impersonate other people in DCU or pretend to be a vendor who wants their bank details changed, etc. So we see that fairly regularly, and I mean, we try to protect against that with, you know, our awareness training program, and with, you know, strong policies in the finance office about who can make changes and under what circumstances, etc. But that's definitely one we see regularly. We also see, I suppose, some automated attacks. So we would have had one of our language school recently. Actually, we had an automated attack on their WordPress site. Now, it was managed and hosted by an external company, but it was an old plugin, and a combination of that with some file system permission errors resulted in the site being taken over and users being redirected to an external site. So we see those kind of automated attacks happening all the time. That one was noticed and dealt with quite quickly, thankfully. We see a lot of attacks on our endpoint. So we use Trellix on our endpoints, and we have Trellix ATP, and we have things set up so that any suspicious activity we see on the endpoint gets shut down and isolated. So I suppose that helps, I suppose, in the scenario where, you know, something happens out of hours in particular, it can be just shut down automatically, and we can investigate then at our leisure when we come back. But we see about 10 or 12 of those a month where, for various reasons, so users might browse to a suspicious website. They might be trying to download some software they shouldn't be, which contains malware. You know, so for various reasons, those automatic host isolations will kick in. The other one we see is credential harvesting. So we were running a project there recently where we're trying to get rid of all of our alumni accounts, which we're not the first, and we probably won't be the last, but we were trying to get rid of all of the old alumni accounts. So we're just getting to the end of that project now, actually. But in the middle of that project, there was a phishing exercise done by some malicious actors, and they emailed a whole list of our alumni, offering them an extension on their account, etc. Very enticing. We had told them their account was going, and these guys were offering them an extension on their account. And the interesting one about that attack was they were redirecting those alumni to a domain, maildcu.com, I think it was called. But that domain was registered 12 months before it was used. So it's almost like it was registered well in advance, sitting there waiting for an opportunity. And again, thankfully, that one we noticed relatively quickly. We were able to pull emails back out of accounts, etc., and we were able to deal with it relatively quickly. But that was an interesting one. And then I suppose the other thing just to mention, I suppose, the emergency hotline that we have set up with SmartTech now, that works quite well. So we had an attack recently where a staff member browsed some website, they got a pop-up on their screen which looked like a system message, and they suspected it was ransomware, and thankfully they picked up the phone and they rang the 24/7 emergency hotline that we have in place, and we were able to investigate that straight away. But we're seeing a myriad of all types of attacks happening.
You know what, Justin? I ask a lot of people that question, and I think that's one of the best answers I've ever actually gotten. Right? You've covered a lot of really interesting attack vectors there, and one of the ones we often talk about quite a lot is the harvesting of credentials, right? And personally, that terrifies me, right? Because as you've alluded to, there's a lot of planning goes into, you know, the registering of domain names, and they find the opportune time to actually strike. Invoice fraud redirection, we probably deal with several of those a week. Unfortunately, in a lot of instances, when we deal with those, we're dealing with them from an incident response perspective. So the company or the organization or the individual has fallen victim to them. But when we talk about credential harvesting, it's something I often say, but 50% of global internet traffic is now automated. They're bots, right? Good bots and bad bots. 30% of that are bad bots, and a lot of that is trying to, you know, get your credentials. And then if these guys manage to get someone's credentials, they're quite proficient in their ability to escalate those credentials on the wire. So that's definitely something that keeps me awake at night. Ger, when you look at, I mean, it's a really interesting, you know, back to our point a minute ago about the learnings from the HSE. A guy like you, right? You're wrestling with all of the challenges that Justin has just touched on, and these are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A lot of them are automated. So while we often envisage that it's lots of hackers sitting in a room, it's actually not, right. A huge degree of it is just an automated wave of attacks, and then if one of those gets a foothold, it'll filter down to actually a human being to move to the next step. But there's a lot of regulation now, and that regulation is requiring public bodies and private bodies to demonstrate a level of compliance on how they handle data and secure data and process data. And you've touched a little bit about that in your introduction. What are the type of, or how do you deal with the pressure that those regulations put on you from an IT perspective, right, and a cyber perspective? Because there's a lot of other stakeholders in UCC or in DCU who are responsible, whether it's legal or HR or the data protection people. What does that segue between those guys and you look like? And then how does that flow out into the different stakeholders in the university? I think you're on mute there, Ger.
No, my apologies. Yeah, thanks, Ronan. Yeah, I'll try to cover that. I mean, overall, I suppose we welcome legislation. It's hard for legislation to keep up with something moving this fast, and legislation brings clarity. So legislation does, once something is a legislative obligation, really we're all rowing at this together. And the legislation is trying to keep up. I mean, GDPR dealt with the regulation probably for personal data. I think we're going to see more on that, around the accountabilities for managing other citizens' data. I think the obligations there are going to grow, and I kind of welcome that clarity. We won't welcome it the day that we have to put all the systems in place, but I think it does bring clarity, and it does help everybody to work together. What we try to do to a large extent, and you touched on this actually earlier, I mean, we can put in the best systems, and we can spend a lot of money on putting in all of the systems that we have, and we have put a lot of systems in. But people remain the weakest link in that, and if somebody, I suppose, has poor data hygiene, we call it, and handles data incorrectly, they can kind of work around the systems. They can inadvertently pull together a spreadsheet with too much sensitive data. They can inadvertently email that to 200 students, so these things can still happen. So I think, so you need a twin track approach. One track is the investment and the precautions we take in to put in controls, tooling, SOC SIEM, Justin has intimated there, to all of the solutions we need to put in. The other part we really need to work on to get everybody working together is to grow awareness, to show people how to keep themselves safe. I kind of think, Ronan, it's a bit like health and safety now. We've an obligation as an employer to train our staff on how to be safe, how to escape from a fire, and these are obviously life-threatening, but I think there's also that obligation now about how to deal with a cyber incident, how to survive it, how to be resilient, how to ring that number and make the IT. So I think growing the awareness within your colleagues, and I think people appreciate that. I think if you do it right, it's not so much we're going to blame you if you make a mistake. It's actually, here are the tools that can help you to spot these problems. And if you think you have pressed that wrong button, here's an option to let us know, and we can quickly interact. And I think if we keep that dynamic going, then we can both be proactive on the technical front, and we can also be proactive on the human front, and just growing that awareness. And I think I mean, we've Cyber Month coming up now this month, and that's an opportunity which we take to kind of run a good few webinars. We bring everybody in; they can do a health check on their machine. We run a weekly info session for both our students and our staff, because we feel there's an obligation on us to kind of educate our students as to that cyber and data hygiene as well. And people have a slight, I think, misconception that the next generation are fully tech savvy, and they're really good with technology, but they really aren't aware of the dangers, I think, about giving their data away. And we feel it's part of our obligation to kind of inculcate that information in them and make them aware of the fact that their data is precious, and they need to hold us accountable for minding it, and they should be careful giving it to anybody else as well. So to summarize the answer, yeah, we try to, I think, use awareness, education, and every opportunity we can get to drive that, so we can get everybody working in the same direction. And to complement the technology controls we put in, we get all those human awareness controls on both our staff and students as well. That's the main, I think, effort we go. There's a phrase I like to use: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I don't know where it came from, but it's trying to create that coalition of people working together without a blame culture to try and help each other survive these kind of threats and risks that we have to our data.
You know what, Ger, you make a really interesting point, and it's something that continues to shock me on a daily basis. And that is, when we look at young people, they're incredibly proficient with technology now, right? They're completely different level to where we would have been when we were young. But I would also argue that they're incredibly naive. The amount of times that we see individuals getting duped online for a whole pile of, whether it's money muling or credential harvesting, or they're going and they're giving away money because somebody has conned them into doing it using social media tactics. It's quite scary, and it's actually quite impressive how these guys are able to successfully catch so many people. So I agree with you that naivety is a huge problem. Justin, if I could ask you the same question that I posed to Ger, right? Considering the regulatory framework, and I want to give another bit of context to how I see the problem, right? I see in many scenarios when there's a large cyber breach, the powers that be will come to the CISO or the CIO and they'll say, what the hell happened? Why did this data exfiltration or data loss occur, right? And on one side of the paradigm, you've got the data protection people who understand the legal obligation of the organization, whether it's a university or whoever. And on the other side, you've the IT and security folks who are typically overstretched, under-resourced, and I would argue in many cases overwhelmed with vulnerabilities and 0 days and invoice fraud redirection and credential harvesting, and it's never ending, right? And then there's a whole regulatory landscape that, they're being asked, because ultimately when a breach happens, they land on the doorstep of the CIO or the CISO or the IT team saying, why the hell did this happen? Or why did this data leave? And in many cases, it feels like there's a disparity between the actual implementation of what's needed from a regulatory perspective versus the actual security controls. So I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, and funnily enough, in DCU a few years back, while we were at the early days, I suppose, of grappling with GDPR and data protection, the IT director was actually the data protection officer in the university as well. So that really muddies the waters to this day, I suppose, with who's responsible and who people come to for advice, etc. But the data protection unit in DCU now is quite well developed, and we have a very good relationship with them. They have a great model set up actually where they've got a data champion model. So basically all the areas around the university, they have a nominee from each area who attends regular meetings chaired by the data protection office, in an effort, I suppose, to raise awareness, and then for those data champions to be the expert in their area. They know the data in their area, they know the workflows, they know the processes, and they know the risks, I suppose. So those data champions then feed back into the data protection office. And that's a model I think that works well in sharing the responsibility, because the other thing about this whole piece is it is about shared responsibility right across the organization. The IT department can't be fully responsible, the data protection office can't be fully responsible. It is shared responsibility right across the organization.
So on that point, Justin, right, and this is just for education, this is just a broad question in the industry. That sounds great in theory until there's a major breach. Yeah. And what I see in many cases, because and this is cross-sector, right, in every sector, it's when something serious happens, typically somebody is thrown under the bus, right? Someone has to come in and say, look, I mean, in your view, right, I mean, what you've described is brilliant. You've got your stakeholders, you've got your data champions. That's the continual process improvement from an educational perspective. But in the unlikely event that, something happened, is there someone that has to be, stand up and be accountable to face, whether it's the media or whoever in that type of scenario? Touch wood, it doesn't happen.
Yeah, so we have an incident response plan in place. So if there is an incident, You know, it's categorized, and once it goes above a certain level, senior management are involved and informed. There is an incident response team that will be gathered together. On that team, you have senior management, you have HR, you have communications, you have data protection, you have IT. So I suppose there is a shared responsibility mindset in how we're going to deal with incidents and how we'll handle things. So, you know, we haven't had a very significant incident or breach in DCU, touch wood, that continues. But I think with the model that's in place with the incident response plan, I'm hoping that there wouldn't be a scapegoat who gets shot on the back of it. And yeah, but as I say, we haven't really had a very serious incident where that's been put to the test.
You would be amazed how many companies, very large private companies, actually overlook building that capability or gamifying. If this did happen, what would we actually do, and how would we have a shared responsibility approach to how we deal with it? I mean, that's super impressive. Gerard, from your perspective, I mean, you know, you've quite an extensive background in the private sector with some very large organizations. Can you give us an example of a successful collaboration between the educational IT function that you now run, and bringing the different stakeholders in the university along on a modernization journey or a security journey, or just an example of how you do that?
Yeah, sure. I certainly will. I wanted to touch on your last question very briefly. I mean, very, very briefly. I mean, it's a danger of our profession that you're going to be accountable as a technical leadership role for a breach. But ultimately, if we look at what happened in PSNI, it wasn't the IT guys that had left I mean, ultimately, the accountable party will be the CEO, actually. You know, I think, and oftentimes the IT people will need to row in behind that. But I guess the reason I mentioned that is they are the people that need to be the most worried that the data hygiene and data culture is right within their organization, I suppose. Because if something goes wrong as epic as that, that's where the accountability will fall. Sorry for the segue.
I think that's a super interesting point you make, just before we jump to the other question, because, I mean, if you're handling data, you could argue that the data that the PSNI are handling, because of who they are, I mean, it's literally life or death. I mean, they're telling, people going to church or being told bring guns with them because of the potential for retribution based on the information that was leaked. But I absolutely agree with you. But I made this point earlier. The data that they touch is so sensitive that there was actually zero controls. I mean, hypothetically, they may have said to people, do not publish this information, but there was actually zero technical controls on such sensitive information. You would assume that they would have digital rights management or data loss prevention or encryption or, alerting based on that data. But in fact, there was nothing.
Yeah. And when those controls are missing, it will be that the head of the organization, in my view, that kind of wears the brunt of it, actually, because they are organizational controls, not just technology. Because the failures there were organizational rather than technology controls. So I just wanted to come in. What was your question? Apologies, just remind me. Oh yes, partnership. So yeah, we've worked well. I mean, again, staying safe and keeping the organization safe does require a multi-functional approach. It requires, everybody, a real team effort between the technology providers, such as the IT unit, and also places like the legal office or the different functional areas. So I have two examples. I mean, one is a simple enough example. We found 10 years ago, the cloud was really, taking off. More and more of our systems are going to the cloud. So we felt, well, we can't just let them all go to the cloud without some kind of technical assessment. And also we need a legal and a data assessment, and we need a commercial assessment. So we established a process that works very well for us. Any data leaving the organization, there's a relatively efficient process between our legal office, our technical staff, and our procurement staff, just to make sure, have we got the commercial agreements? Do we understand the data agreements? And is it technically sound? Because people were giving away, free IT solutions, but what you were paying for it with your data, because you were giving them your data for free, and you were signing away all your rights to your data. And as someone once said, if you're not paying for the service, then you're the product, not the customer. So we established that, and that worked very well because it educated all of us, we got better understanding of the legal and data implications and the commercial implications, and their legal teams and procurement teams got a bit more cognizant of the technical implications, and that worked very well. And we've probably moved 200 to 300 different data services over the last decade, and they've all gone through that check. And the other one, and actually it's an important phase of our cybersecurity response now, is this organizational resilience piece that we're working on. And that kind of is really to say, well, God forbid we're compromised or hacked in some way. How do we go on? What's the critical path, and how will we continue? Because it's kind of different than a disaster recovery from years ago, whereby a server would fail and you'd be 3 or 4 days and you'd be back. I mean, if you have a serious cyber event, and I'm touching wood, you could not be able to use those systems for a month or two. So, well, how are we going to teach? And we've worked very well over the last 12 months trying to figure that out, trying to figure out, let's put the cyber piece aside for a moment, and we'll have to deal with that. But let's work with our functional areas, saying, well, how are we going to pay people? And that could be radically in terms of your thought process. How are we going to teach? How is teaching going to continue when we maybe say that the on-premise IT infrastructure is toxic? And can we stand up a new cloud-based? Because we're trying to, one of the things I do notice from some of the public attacks that happened, yes, there was massive damage from the data loss, but they were also very severely service impacted for a very long time. And we're trying to figure out, well, first of all, we're trying to be proactive and keep the bad guys out. But also, if we do get compromised, what's our resilience? How can we get back teaching, within days rather than weeks if possible? And that lowers the stress on the students. It lowers the stress on the staff. And how can we maybe continue the critical functions, like to pay our staff, like to run certain critical functional areas, maybe. And it's even dreaming the impossible. Imagine you have no systems. What are you actually going to do? It involves standing up a laptop, standing up a quick cloud service, thinking outside the box about how you can continue with the critical functions of the organization. So that's the second example, I think, in light of some of the events. How do we build that organizational resilience and think outside the box of how we're going to stand back up our services in the event something does happen? So that they're two examples, Ronan, of good partnership.
Yeah, that's it. No, that's you've answered that incredibly eloquently. Can I ask you, Ger, in terms of, I know this is an odd question, but do you guys ever worry about students? A disgruntled student who's very savvy and who's going to try and sabotage you. Is that ever something that comes front of mind?
Okay, well, I suppose it's a great question. First of all, we definitely worry about students. I think we do have an obligation. Our students aren't just our customers, they're part of the community. So the first part of it, we actually worry about educating students who are entering a very digital world to make sure they have those digital skills and they can stay safe in that digital world. And we have it's one of our predominant obligations is to keep their data safe. So we worry about them on lots of levels. But in terms of as a threat, do we worry about students? Our student systems are very SaaS orientated, and the climate and the working environment for our students, we almost assume a degree of dirty networks, whereby people might have so we've actually tried to defend against that. Now, if a student was a PhD student, they might have access to kind of sensitive research data. That's slightly different, but they would be bound through ethical. When a student is doing a lot of research training, they're almost no longer a student. They're actually signing up the staff terms and conditions at that point.
Yes.
So when a student is really enacting as a student, I feel we put enough controls in our technology stack that they couldn't get access to sensitive data unless they compromise the staff account. So we don't worry. As a threat actor, they're probably no different than a criminal from outside. They don't have any greater access to our systems and our servers, to be honest. As they move into the research domain, they gain those access, but then they have to sign off to terms and conditions that legally bind them to take a different role as the data they access. I don't know if
that's super interesting. Justin, could I put the same question to you? Large student body, PhDs, public-private partnerships. How do you guys view that?
Yeah, so we touched on this briefly yesterday, Gerard, but we're definitely sort of, I suppose, trying to move towards a more corporate model of managing our endpoints and our network in DCU. Now we're by no means there yet, but part of that is we do, I suppose, keep staff and students very segregated on the network. And that has been in place for a long time, but it is a really important protection for us. So we do see them, but then the grey areas do come in, for sure. But we are moving towards, I suppose, anybody who's getting access to secure area network would have to be on a managed device. You know, any of those BYOD devices, they're segregated off into a kind of a visitor area. And, you know, we accept that there are going to be Wild West areas on the network, but we keep those to be BYOD devices, untrusted identities, untrusted devices. And we try and protect everything, as you mentioned, your zones earlier, Ger. As you get closer to sensitive areas of network, sensitive data, etc., the controls increase. And, you know, so you have to be on a trusted device, you have to be on the VPN, etc., etc., etc. So it's about the layers of the onion and the defense in depth.
Absolutely. Can I ask you, Justin? I want to give you a scenario, right? So we 2-3 weeks ago we were dealing with a high degree of incident response for different customers who had outsourced their SAP, and their SAP was sitting on a managed third-party cloud provider, and the cloud provider had fallen victim to a pretty significant ransomware attack. So therefore, every single server they had in their data center, which they were delivering as a SaaS environment, was encrypted. And all of these companies were literally put out of business overnight because they had assumed that their SaaS provider would have been, not susceptible to that type of attack. And the damage, I mean, is a bit like what Ger said. These guys were down for 2 months because when SAP goes down, you know, it runs your business. And it really got me thinking about the whole risk that we see with the third-party suppliers. And obviously we know about the high-profile ones like SolarWinds and Kaseya and these other ones that have happened. But there's a whole pile of under-the-line SaaS providers who frequently get attacked because they haven't implemented controls, whether it's at the vulnerability level or at the redundancy level on how they deliver SaaS capabilities. So I know this is not a question we'd planned, but you guys are answering these questions so eloquently. I'm interested in your perspective on third-party suppliers and because again, you're so busy and you've so much on your plate. Is it ever something that enters your head, okay, I'm going to use a third-party supplier, but, you know, are they liable to get hit with a ransomware attack or data exfiltration? You know, I'm curious about your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, come back to Gerard's point earlier. So we do have controls and policies, etc., in place when anyone in the organization is looking to use one of those external providers or SaaS solution, etc. You know, we do have a policy doc in place, which people must read, must follow. The vendor fills it in. We do a sort of an assessment of the vendor, the solution, the practices, etc. And we try and get ourselves into a position where, you know, we don't sign up to any solutions where we think there is significant risk. But it's impossible. Like even when you assess a vendor, and they provide all sorts of SOC 2 reports, etc., and whatever you can review, it still doesn't give you any guarantees that they're not going to suffer that attack and they're not going to be compromised. So we do our best to think about all the risks in that area and assess them and try and protect ourselves. But all you can do is the best you can.
Yeah, I agree. I'll tell you, and I'm going to actually I want you, George, to share your perspective on that. But just a quick one. We recently got approved in Get Visibility to deliver our services to the Singaporean government. But in order to deliver it to the Singaporean government, we had to have diligence done on our technology and the security of our technology, which took about 12 months of absolutely robust security testing, penetration testing, vulnerability testing. And it really, really sweated us to make sure that we were not going to be a potential ransomware victim to this as we supply into the Singaporean government. And it's something that really struck me, that type of diligence provided by a government agency could really make the process of procuring cloud services for public bodies something more seamless if there was a dedicated team of experts looking at it on their behalf. It was just something I thought was interesting. Gerard, could you maybe share your perspective on that same question?
Yeah, and I think your points there are kind of well made as well, actually. I mean, we're at the early days of digital. You know,
Yes.
It's been going on 50, 60 years, but we're still probably, you know, relative to other things. So you know, the policy frameworks, the standards, such as NIS2, and the EU are likely to bring NIS2 out as a kind of a policy direction into the future. That's all helpful, because what you want is a baseline, and what you want is to be able to legally hold your provider accountable for the baseline. Yes. And yes, we are in that kind of uncomfortable territory now where the goalposts are still moving, where the legislative obligations and the standards are probably just not written in yet. And, you know, cyber's growing so fast that there is a little bit of a Wild West. So what you do have to, as Justin just pointed out, you've got to apply a lot of common sense about, is there sensitive data going out here in this? And is there encryption standards? And how, you know, how deeply, in a way, you know, how much sensitive data are we giving? And are we comfortable with that? And we need to look, how deeply do we have to look? Hopefully, it will never be trivial, but hopefully that will become more standardized, you know, as, you know, and we think of the same in medical profession. You know, we send off our bloods to be done by certified organizations who are certified to do that. And we'll need the same with our data. We will need to be guaranteed that there are policy frameworks in place that stabilize this, and that we and therefore will make it more straightforward to get a bit of comfort, a legally binding comfort, that there's a proper baselining of cybersecurity. And having said all that, due diligence of some kind is always going to be warranted, because A, there are moving parts, and B, you know, the stakes are so high. I also to just touch on your last point, which I think is very relevant as well. I do think, you know, government agencies are going to need to spend more and more of their resource stack on cyber. And that's not just defending against cyber attack. It's everything. It's, you know, what's our procurement for new services and solutions. And I love hearing what the due diligence the Singaporean government, you know, were able to put into these things to kind of look into all that. And we need to be doing that, because you make these decisions for 20 years practically, you know, when you make these investments, and the stakes are so high. So I do think we're all going to have to face up to more and more IT resources being dedicated to, you know, vendor management from a cyber perspective, cyber proactive controls, awareness, all the things you talked about. I foresee 30 or 40% of the resources in an IT department with a predominant focus on cyber activity, you know, in the future. And that's going to have a bearing, you know, on the cost of doing business as well. So we just need to, I think, adjust our budgets accordingly over time on that. And we're going to have to continue to put more of our resourcing into cyber protection, not just from products and services, but also on all of the other things that means, in terms of the extra due diligence we got to put when we buy something, the extra awareness we got to drive into our. So just make that point as well, as we're going to have to, a growing proportion of our budgets are going to have to continue to be focused on protecting the organ, because the consequences are just too catastrophic when it goes wrong.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Ronan, just to add to that, like one of the big challenges we have at the moment is around staffing, and I think, like, all of this is fine, but you do need skilled staff, yes, to execute all of these things. And that's one of the biggest challenges I think we all have at the moment, is trying to get and keep those staff that have the technical expertise. Now, it's fine, like, we can have a great relationship with the likes of Smart Tech, and we can have that expertise to lean on, but you still always need internal expertise. And as you say, Ger, like, the amount of that expertise that's required on an ongoing basis now is increasing all the time. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have now and into the future.
I think that's a point very well made. I mean, it's estimated there's 2 million job vacancies in the cyber sector. And it's a pretty unforgiving sector. I mean, it's high stakes poker, right? There's not a whole pile of margin for error. So it's, yeah, I think the more students you guys spit out with those capabilities, the better. So guys, we're coming up on our 45 minutes. So just before we wrap up, I'd like to get into some of the salacious stuff, right? And have the presidents in either university come to you guys and said, listen, Gerard, Justin, what are we going to do about ChatGPT? And how are we going to stop these students acing all of their exams? Has that been a discussion? I mean, how's that going?
I can pick it up if that's all right, Justin. Firstly, yes. I mean, it's never. Universities have never succeeded in turning a blind eye to technology and being afraid to technology. So what organizations need to do, and what our university needs to look at, is actually maybe we should put ChatGPT into the curriculum and say to your student, go off and use ChatGPT, tell us what that says, and critique it and compare it to what the real answer is. So take it out of the box, because they're entering a workforce in a world where AI is going to be built into the products we use. It's built into Zoom here we're on today, and that would be our philosophy, is to maybe make students aware that we are looking for it, in our assessments, and so on. Design assessments that are not as susceptible to it, and you can do that. You can kind of design certain activities into the assessment that make it so, and maybe just not be afraid of it. Take it out of the box and say, we know that's a tool that's out there now, so yeah, use it if you wish, and let's assess what you think are the gaps or what's wrong. So I think we kind of need to make peace with it, a bit like the calculator or the spell checker. It's going to come. We need to adjust our assessments. We need to build AI into our curriculum in general, not so much the theory behind AI, but the practical applications of it in medicine and law and all the rest of it, because it's going to transform the job market. And I do think we should start to actually use it in the assessment process, because that will break down the fear that, well, we know it's there and we know you can use it, so we're kind of aware of it, so don't try it on, let's so I think that's the answer, is to be proactive, and the technology is going to happen. It's going to transform the world anyway, so trying to defend against it is pointless in my view.
Justin?
I agree with everything Ger has said, and there was actually conversations in DCU debating on whether we should be trying to detect the use of ChatGPT in assignment submissions, etc. And thankfully sense prevailed, and the decision was made not to try and detect, because it's a fool's errand. But yeah, I agree with everything Ger has said, and I suppose the other piece that is interesting is, like, really this is probably just the tip of the iceberg. So the exponential growth of this area and these tools, etc. The dam has already burst, and the water is going to come flooding very heavy. So we need to get ready. Yeah.
Absolutely. Justin, Ger, can I say we do a lot of these? I think the pragmatic and focused approach you guys are taking from a security perspective, from an incident response perspective, from a common sense perspective, really is outstanding. Thank you so much for the contribution today. Really enjoyed the discussion, and catch up soon.